Known for having contributed to establishing the punk movement in the United States, they are cited as the first actual punk rock band. All the members of this band used pseudonyms paired with the same last name, which is Ramones. In reality, however, they were not related to each other. In doing so, they were inspired by Paul McCartney, but we will see this later. I'm obviously talking about the Ramones. What can we say to start about this band? We can say many things. The first thing that comes to mind is that the Ramones, especially at the beginning of their career and for the first few years, did not achieve commercial success. However, their importance in culture, in punk culture, in music culture, in social culture, in fashion, has been recognized over time and lasts a lifetime. The story of the Ramones is the extraordinary adventure of four 20-somethings from New York, who, wanting to bring rock and roll back to the energy and fun of its origins, invented punk. And they did it with their Metropolitan gang look. They also did it through catchy slogans, and thanks to a whole series of minimal songs played at lightning speed. The artistic journey of the Fast Four is also a shining example of resilience in the face of adversity, absolute dedication to their group, and infinite love for their fans. The genius of the Ramones, in essence, lies in the fact that they say in 2 minutes what most bands say in 5. Basically, you listen to one of their songs and it feels like you've known it forever. Does that seem insignificant to you? Anyway, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the Ramones are very important for their lifestyle, for what they have left us. But when I talk about lifestyle, what am I referring to? I am referring to the rejection of the past, the desire to create something new. In fact, the Ramones introduced an anti-look that in turn became an original look consisting of leather jackets, tight t-shirts, ripped jeans, and tennis shoes that, in its caricatured appearance, seemed to mock everything and everyone. But the greatest desecration was from a strictly musical point of view. In Tommy's words, we transported the sound of rock into a psychotic world and concentrated it into a thin line of energy. In the era of prog, with its complexities and counterpoints, prog rock preceding punk, the Ramones had a perspective of non-musicality and intelligence that took precedence over musical skill. However, it was not so much about mocking musical technique, which the Sex Pistols did, but rather about the deliberate rejection of a certain technicality that in the early 70s, and I'm always referring to prog, became an end in itself, to the detriment of youthful rebellious spontaneity, communicative immediacy, and the desire to entertain and enjoy oneself. In fact, the songs of the Fast Four were characterized by a few chords framed in a wall of distorted guitar, a pulsating rhythm section, very few embellishments, and the truly unique, enveloping voice of Joey Ramone. In short, from here we understand that despite all the chaos that will come and that we will create and witness, the Ramones were connected by an indissoluble common thread. However, before starting, in this particular case, I would like to introduce you to the 4 original members of the band because their personalities and their experiences are truly, truly important for everything that will follow. Let's start with the wild one of the group, which is D.D. Ramone. D.D. Ramone, pseudonym of Douglas Glenn Coleman. D.D. spent his teenage years, the 1960s, among the ruins in Germany because his father was a military man stationed there. The young boy roamed unsupervised, scavenging among the still present ruins of World War II, finding gas masks, swastikas, pieces of helmets. In short, Nazi memorabilia of all kinds. And he was fascinated by these objects. And then when his parents separated, Didi returned to America with his mother, but he was always a reckless boy, and so he began to wander around hitchhiking. In one of these adventures, he met some kids who convinced him to take part in a robbery. He was arrested and imprisoned, spending months in an Indiana prison. And this experience would shape him for better or worse. Johnny Ramone, pseudonym of Johnny William Cummings, was the guitarist of the Ramones. Johnny was the most authoritarian member of the group, also known as the man who threw TVs off roofs. He used fear and intimidation to become and remain the leader of the band. In an interview, Joey's brother Mike recalls that Johnny ran the Ramones like a military operation. In fact, it seems he verbally abused Tommy and regularly punched the others for any minor infraction. Moreover, he had little sensitivity towards Joey's health issues. It will be him in his autobiography who describes himself this way. I had been in a series of bad and violent behaviors for 2 years. I was simply mean every minute of the day. During these years, in the years of anger, he did things that were dangerous to say the least. Not so much for himself, but for others. In fact, he had the habit of taking old televisions to rooftops to throw them off and see what would happen, with the aim of scaring people. Another thing he loved to throw was bricks. Fortunately, this didn't last forever, but was limited to a certain period of time. And now let's move on to the most charismatic character, probably of the band. I'm talking about Joey Ramones. Joey Ramones, pseudonym of Jeffrey Ross Heyman, was the charismatic singer of the band. Joey Ramones always struggled with his health. He was born with a teratoma, which is a parasitic twin the size of a baseball-sized mass attached to his spine. Fortunately, this teratoma was removed from him surgically, but it left him with poor blood circulation and increased vulnerability to infections. Unfortunately, Joey also suffered from mental health issues. In fact, from a young age, he suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder, which led him to repeatedly perform certain actions to neutralize his obsession. Consider that a very sensitive doctor, because at that time they were truly very sensitive, told Joy's mother that her son would become as he grew up. A vegetable, referring to his ability to exist in the world. But Joy's revenge would later be to become an eternal icon. However, his problems did not end there. In fact, his elongated limbs were not officially diagnosed at the time, but it was probably Marfan syndrome, which is a rare hereditary connective tissue disorder that causes ocular, bone, cardiac alterations, as well as changes in blood vessels, lungs, and the central nervous system. But all of this, despite the suffering, probably gave him that unique physicality. And I repeat, it's a term I often use, iconic. However, Johnny didn't share the same opinion, as he often got angry because Joey, at certain times, especially when he was suffering or unwell, could take hours to cover a stretch of road, which tested Johnny's patience. Tommy Ramones, also known as Thomas Ederle, was the most normal and the most reserved of them all, and he was also the most musically prepared. Thomas Ederle's family, also known as Tommy Ramones, survived the Nazi roundups. Furthermore, during the Hungarian Revolution, his family managed to cross the Austrian border and then set sail for America. Here they settled in Fawcett Hills, a predominantly Jewish middle-class neighborhood in Queens, New York. And this is where it all begins. It's 1972, and everything is quiet, in the sense that the Sex Pistols and the Clash still don't know how to channel their anger, whereas these four guys from New York just want to have fun, make music. They don't even know how to play well. Really poorly, but they want to create something completely new. Only they're still groping in the dark. The first to think of something are Johnny and Tommy, who meet in high school and decide to form a band called Tangerine Puppets. But it will be Tommy, the driving force, the backbone, who will try to convince Johnny to create something new. In fact, at that time, Tommy was working as a sound technician at the Record Plant recording studio, which had seen the recordings of Jimi Hendrix, just imagine. At the same time, the group New York Dolls was born. And it was there that Johnny became convinced. He became convinced that it was possible to make different music. In fact, New York Dolls, along with the Velvet Underground and the Stooges, were, one of the first bands of the punk rock scene. And so it was that one afternoon, just any afternoon, at Johnny Ramone's house, they met with Tommy, Didi, and a mutual friend, that is, the future joy of the Ramones. It was then that Tommy received permission to let these guys rehearse in the studios managed by Monty Melnick. Monty Melnick would become a great playwright and also the official biographer of the Ramones. Where does the name come from? It comes from the fact that Didi Ramone was very amused by an anecdote he had heard about Paul McCartney. McCartney, in fact, when he wanted to go around without being recognized, would check into hotels as Paul Ramone, and this inspired the name of the band. The original lineup had Tommy on guitar and Joey on drums, but Joey's performance on the instrument was too slow. So Tommy took his place while Didi Ramone stepped down. He handed the microphone to Joey, who became the front man and focused on the bass. However, it was right here that Didi, who had started as the singer, began doing what characterizes the Ramones, which is setting the tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4, and he continued to do it. And this also became a hallmark of the band. The Ramones held their first concert at Melnick Studios, March 30th, 1974. And they put in a lot of effort because they handed out flyers to advertise the event and charged $2 for the ticket. About 30 of their friends came, but it was a complete disaster. Didi smashed the bass after 2 songs. Then he was so drunk that he fell backward and also broke the amplifier. And at the next event, so no one showed up. The song lyrics, bordering on verbal delirium, showed total disengagement. But this disengagement was the band's constant commitment to rejecting the seriousness that befits a musician. There was a cartoon-like atmosphere. The Ramones sang about youthful neurosis, mental insanity, the California sun, bats, baseball bats, and silly teenage loves. And soon their cry, their absurd yet striking motto, became, "Hey ho, let's go." Another tidbit is this. Like many bands, the Ramones also had superstitious rituals. One of these was eating curry before every concert, so they often had extremely spicy food brought to them. But this also led them, and in the future, their organization, to always keep buckets near the stage. Why all these spices? In the end, they made them vomit, so the necessary items were always within reach. At that time, the music scene in New York was focusing on 2 emerging clubs, which I'll show you in the photo. And it was right here that on August 16th, the Ramones actually made their true debut, and surprised many people indeed. They became a regular presence because they were truly the only ones who didn't copy anyone. Guys, because there was no one like them. A testament to everything I'm telling you. It was the first album by the Ramones released in '76, which was called Ramones, featuring 14 songs on the album. The longest was I Don't Want to Go Down to the Basement, which was just over 2.5 minutes. The album lasts just half an hour and left people speechless in the sense that it felt like they were witnessing the year 0 of music. But how did the Ramones really start to be taken seriously? Very simple, when they did their first tour in England. Well, yes, we're still in '76, the tour organized by Linda Stephen, and during their first night at the Mile Roundhouse in London, there were many personalities at that event. Among them stood out Mark Bolan, who was even invited on stage. But the following evening, the historic meeting took place. In fact, that evening, both the Sex Pistols and the Clash were present. Well, guys, you can draw your own conclusions here. In '77, 2 albums were released, Leave Home and Rocket to Russia, both produced by Tommy Bon Jovi, second cousin of the much more famous Johnny Bon Jovi. It should be noted that punk as it arrived in England never really belonged to the Ramones. In fact, it was also a hindrance to their career in a certain sense. The Ramones absolutely did not have that energy, that self-destructive restlessness that belonged to the Sex Pistols. Nor did they have the social commitment typical of the Clash. The Ramones never really climbed the charts, but their success was driven by the audience. True, in fact, they always gave their best, especially during live performances. In fact, even without media success, more and more people started attending their concerts. And that's when the first change happened. We arrive in 78, and Tommy retired in the sense that he left the group as a musician, but continued to be their producer for the next 4 albums. He never regretted this decision because he said that if he had continued, it would have led him to self-destruction due to stress and also conflicts with Johnny Ramone. And so his place was taken by Marky Bell, known as Marky Ramone. Road to Ruin is the group's 4th album, released in 78, and it was the first with Marky Ramone on drums. It was during this period that a historic meeting took place with a figure as great as he was controversial, and I'm talking about Phil Spector. In fact, after the band's cinematic debut in the film Rock and Roll High School, a 1979 movie, Phil Spector took a serious interest in the band. Phil Spector, as I mentioned, was an immense figure. He was the one who produced Lady B. And also some solo records by Johnny Lennon, Ike, Tina Turner, but I can also mention other artists such as Ramones, and he was the husband of the singer of this group. But Phil Spector was also a fierce murderer. Indeed, Phil Spector, being so eccentric and peculiar in his personality, it is said that to achieve certain results with the group, he used very strong coercion. Especially psychological coercion, but not only that. Until that moment, Ramone, to record their albums, had not taken more than 2 or 3 days, whereas Felix Petter was someone who would take 2 or 3 days just to start analyzing a song. And so there are stories of certain episodes where he would make them repeat the piece 30, 40, 50 times to the person, the musician who, in short, didn't get it right the first time. And he especially did this with Johnny and Dee Dee Ramone. It should also be mentioned that Ramone still relied on him, because until that moment they had not achieved satisfactory results. So they began to realize that maybe they needed to change something. Indeed, for better or worse, Spector would leave his mark. Riding the wave of end of the century, which completely departed from the raw and harsh sound of the early Ramones, there is also the subsequent album, that is Pleasant Dreams from 81. But it was with Subterranean Jungle, the next album from 83, that the Ramones somewhat rediscovered their trashy sound. How can we define it? But in the broad sense of the term as it was defined back then. It's just that they were going through a really difficult period after end of the century, after coming into contact with Phil Spector. In fact, their mental problems, their discomforts had amplified. In fact, Dee Dee, and unfortunately, he was known to make excessive use of drugs. Joey Ramone had his problems, Johnny had lost motivation, and Marky was an alcoholic to extreme levels, to the point that after Subterranean Jungle he retired or was fired. In any case, he was no longer able to continue, at least for a certain period. And Marky was replaced by Richie Reinhardt, known as Richie Ramone. And that was an immense breath of fresh air for the band. Richie was a breath of fresh air. He could really play, he could keep up with the pace, and he could even sing some songs. And so the band was truly happy. And this is also because I haven't yet mentioned that Johnny and Joey Ramone weren't speaking to each other and wouldn't speak until Johnny's death. And this was because, for various reasons, including a romantic dispute, Joey, the shy one, was a liberal with countercultural values, and Johnny was a conservative, a staunch Republican who hated hippie parasites. Their personalities clashed as well. According to everyone, Joey was a romantic and also the kindest member of the band, whereas Johnny was the cruelest. And he tormented Joey, sometimes with anti-Semitic comments, showing no understanding for him or his health. But what made matters worse was that in the early 80s, Johnny had stolen his girlfriend Joy. Linda, who would later marry Johnny, was Joey's girlfriend at one point in their history. She left him abruptly to decide to go with Johnny. And the two would then be together, they would get married. The consequence was that the two completely stopped talking to each other. This, I repeat, until 2001, Johnny's death. But they continued to play together for many years, communicating through intermediaries. So if they wanted to communicate, others had to speak for them. Why did they never confront each other again? Even though legend has it that when Johnny died, or rather when Joy died, Johnny went into depression. But we are not sure about this. The first album, recorded with Richie Ramones in 1984, returned to the pounding rhythms like a jackhammer of the beginning. And everyone was very happy about this. And the track, Bon Jovi Goes to Pittsburgh, created further a controversy within the band between Joy and Johnny, because the song was indeed written by Joy as a protest against Ronald Reagan's visit to Germany in 85. Ronald Reagan, during his visit to the military cemetery in Bitburg in 85 in West Germany, had laid a wreath on the monument dedicated to the fallen and the victims of Nazism. Unfortunately, in this cemetery there were also graves of former SS members. And so Ronald Reagan also paid tribute to their memory, saying that everyone had been victims of the war. And this, in short, divided the world, so to speak, in two. Joey Ramone was absolutely bewildered and angry about this statement, whereas Johnny had always had sympathies for Reagan. Little Steven, former guitarist of Bruce Springsteen, was impressed by the lyrics, and especially by the part, "You're a politician, don't become one of Hitler's children." And so he asked Joey to join Bruce and about 50 other musicians for Artists United Against Apartheid, which also released an album. And Joey would end up having a small part in the single Sun City. Animal Boy from 86 was an album full of acknowledgements in which Richie Ramone left his very pleasant mark. Anyway, back to us after Halfway to Sun, Richie. He left because he had issues with Johnny, mainly financial issues. But not only that, and he was replaced by Klemberg from Blondie, who had just disbanded. But Klemberg was absolutely not right for the band. Or rather, it is said that he was absolutely not right, even though the members of the Ramones had courted him when Richie said he would leave. He joined the band under the name Elvis Ramone, but actually only did a handful of concerts and appearances. Some say it was because he wasn't capable, but I have my doubts about this, honestly. The truth probably was that Marky Ramone had recovered in the meantime, and so they wanted him back with them. The upheavals and changes within the Ramones had settled. Also because we are approaching the 90s, and that was the period when Ramone took a real nosedive, and he hit rock bottom, and all for the King. In his solo album, Standing in the Spotlight, there's a track and also the video Funky Man, which is up to you to judge. In 89, there was another legendary meeting, Queen Gav, and the Ramones album, Brain Drain, was released. The Ramones also passed through Italy. And here it came out that Stephen King had always been a devoted fan. He even organized a concert for them, but that's not all. The Ramones wrote the track for Stephen King's film of the same name, Pet Cemetery. And here too, I ask for your opinion, because I don't know, for me, that is a piece that gets into your head and never leaves. And in its simplicity, it manages to evoke many, many emotions. That is the greatness of the Ramones. Anyway, at the end of the tour, Dee Dee Ramone left the band for good. The whole thing left people a bit surprised. The others only that he wanted to pursue a solo career as a rapper mainly, and he also had various formations more or less similar to the Ramones. Johnny Ramone, following Dee Dee's decision to leave the band, made some statements, one of which was that he had never been right in the head because he had always used substances excessively, much more than the others. He had tried to detoxify himself over and over again, succeeding but then falling back into the habit. During that period, he had also divorced his real wife. In short, he had really lost his way. And anyway, this choice was not very successful because it's not like he had everything. This great success as a solo artist, especially for the musical choice he made. Unfortunately, Didi had also been arrested in '90 because he was caught in a raid buying a dose for personal use in a park in New York. And he was also caught in the bathroom of a local place. Well, I won't go into details. But the popularity of the Ramones is, and was, in that period, so in the early '90s, intact. And that's when emerging bands of that time began to contact them and pay tribute to them. Emerging bands and others. In fact, I'm talking about Soundgarden, who asked Johnny to introduce them at a memorable evening at Madison Square Garden with Guns N' Roses. And I'm also talking about Lemmy Kilmister and Motorhead, who had dedicated a song even to the Ramones, which was called Ramones and was included in their album 1916. In fact, Motorhead and the Ramones have always had a connection since the beginning of their careers. The Bizarre World of '92 was the first studio album without Didi, even though he is present as a composer, having written some tracks. And there was also a general excitement for the newcomer, Didi's replacement, namely CJ Ramon. The 1993 tour was wonderful and found the Ramones in stadiums all over the world, which were packed with people, but already the idea began to emerge that the band might break up, which would happen 3 years later. And the next album in '95 left little room for speculation because the title said it all and was called Adios, Amigos. Interesting in this album is the opening song, I Don't Want to Grow Up, sung by Tom Waits. On August 6, 1996, there was the last great definitive concert of the Ramones at the Palace in Los Angeles, which was packed. Many figures from the rock world participated on stage, including our own Tommy Kimmins from Motorhead, but also Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, or Chris Cornell and Ben Shepherd from Soundgarden, and many others. Among them was also Didi, of course, thanks to whom the Ramones became what they became. In fact, it was also thanks to him that everything evolved in such a great way, because let's remember that Didi was the author of many of the band's hit songs. After this last concert, Johnny hung up his guitar while Joey dabbled as a DJ at a station, a New York radio station, focusing on his solo work, which would later be released posthumously. Meanwhile, CJ and Marky continued with other bands. And now comes the sad part, because unfortunately the founding members of the Ramones, that is, I'm talking about Joey, Johnny A, Didi, and Tommy, all passed away very early. About a month before his 50th birthday, on April 15, 2001, Joey Ramone died of lymphoma. It is said that he was listening to the song In a Little While by U2 when he died. His solo album, Don't Worry About Me, was released posthumously in 2002. It includes the single What a Wonderful World, which is a cover of the Louis Armstrong standard. The most significant tribute was given by the city of New York to this great artist. In fact, on May 19th, 2001, would have been Joey's birthday, and a huge party was held. The Joey Ramone birthday party was truly moving, with many personalities attending, including Little Steven. Little Steven read and commented on a document from the United States Congress proclaiming Joey Ramone as one of the most influential figures in rock music worldwide. And this was undoubtedly so moving that Joey Ramone Day now was proclaimed every May 19th, his birthday. Didi Ramone had at least the satisfaction compared to Joey of seeing the Ramone name enshrined in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002, but he died shortly after his birthday. Unfortunately, he died at an overdose. Didi Ramone, as I have mentioned several times, always had this back and forth with substances, and unfortunately, since he had been clean for a long time, he took a dose. He had probably relapsed into one of his worst states. This dose wasn't even that strong, but since he had been clean for so long, unfortunately, he died. On September 15th, 2004, it was also the turn of the only guitarist the Ramones ever had. And I'm talking about Johnny, who passed away due to prostate cancer. A character with a very strong personality and a great sense of self-discipline. Let's remember, Johnny was the element that did his job, catalyst of the fast four. And in certain cases, despite his very strong methods, he was the mediator between personalities within the band, sometimes very exuberant and especially prone to self-destruction. Among the many things that will remain of him, let's remember that Johnny actually invented the classic pose that many imitate today. That is, with legs spread apart and the guitar held very low, practically below the waist. The last of the Ramones founders to pass away was Tommy on July 11th, 2014. He died due to bile duct cancer, and he always stood out for a lifestyle that was different from that of his bandmates, as he was a much calmer person. So guys, I send you a hug, the usual all-encompassing hug. And I ask you, as always, if you would like to add your opinions and observations in the comments. I really care about you. Bye.